Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button because today we're diving deep into a story that might sound eerily familiar to anyone struggling with rent in a major city right now. We're talking about London in the 1600s, when the city experienced what might be the first modern housing crisis that literally pushed poor people out of their homes and changed the face of urban living forever. Now, I want you to imagine this scene. It's 1666, and you're living in medieval London. Your family has occupied the same cramped wooden house for generations. The streets are narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass each other. Buildings lean so close together that neighbors on opposite sides of the street can practically shake hands from their upper windows. The smell is absolutely horrendous because there's no real sanitation system. Chamber pots are emptied into the streets, and the Thames River is basically an open sewer. But here's the thing. This is your home. Your grandfather lived here, your father lived here, and you assumed you'd die here too. Rent was relatively affordable because, honestly, who would want to pay much for these conditions anyway? But then everything changed in the span of just a few years, and it wasn't because of some economic policy or urban planning initiative. It was because of fire. The Great Fire of London in September 1666 destroyed approximately 13,000 houses. Let me put that into perspective for you. We're talking about 80% of the city within the old Roman walls just gone, turned to ash in the span of 4 days. Over 70,000 of the city's 80,000 inhabitants lost their homes. It started in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of September 2nd, and because everything was built from wood and pitch, and because there had been a long hot summer that dried everything out, the fire spread like you wouldn't believe. The old London Bridge, which was packed with houses and shops, became a corridor of flames. St. Paul's Cathedral, the medieval version, melted. The lead from the roof turned into rivers of molten metal flowing through the streets. But here's where our story really begins. Because what happened after the fire is what created London's first real housing disaster. King Charles II and the city authorities saw this catastrophe as an opportunity. They decided they weren't going to rebuild the same cramped, unsanitary medieval city. No, they were going to create a modern metropolis with wide streets, brick buildings, and proper planning. Sounds great, right? Well, it was great if you had money. The new building regulations mandated that all new construction had to be done in brick or stone. No more wooden buildings. Streets had to be widened to prevent fire from jumping from building to building. Properties had to meet specific standards for height and construction quality. Now think about what this meant for the average person who just lost everything in the fire. You're a tradesman, maybe a cobbler or a baker. Your shop and home just burned down. You have almost nothing left. And now you're being told that if you want to rebuild, you need to construct a brick building that meets new expensive standards on a street that is now twice as wide as before, meaning your property just got smaller. The cost of rebuilding under these new regulations was astronomical compared to what people were used to. A simple wooden structure could be thrown up relatively cheaply by any carpenter. But brick construction, that required skilled masons, expensive materials that had to be transported from outside the city, and significant time. The wealthy merchants and aristocrats could afford to rebuild, and they did so quickly. They constructed beautiful Georgian townhouses with multiple stories, proper foundations, and all the modern amenities of the time. But the poor and working class were completely priced out. The property owners who held the land before the fire either sold to wealthy developers or rebuilt expensive properties themselves, which they then rented out at rates that reflected their construction costs. Suddenly, rent in central London wasn't just about paying for a roof over your head. It was about paying for brick walls, wide streets, and fire prevention measures. So what happened to all those poor Londoners who couldn't afford the new rents? They were pushed out to the suburbs and outlying areas that weren't subject to the same building regulations. Places like Shoreditch, Whitechapel, and Southwark, which had previously been relatively small settlements outside the city walls, suddenly exploded with population. These areas became overcrowded almost overnight, because you had tens of thousands of people competing for housing in areas that weren't designed to accommodate them. And because these places weren't subject to the same strict regulations, developers could build cheap, cramped housing to maximize profit from desperate renters. The conditions in these new slums were absolutely appalling. We're talking about entire families crammed into single rooms, multiple families sharing houses that were barely standing. The sanitation that was bad in medieval London somehow got even worse in these overcrowded suburbs because the infrastructure simply couldn't handle the population density. Disease was rampant. Child mortality rates were astronomical. But what choice did people have? They couldn't afford to live in the newly rebuilt city center, and they needed to be close enough to commute to whatever work they could find. This created a geographic class division that London had never really experienced before. Wealth became concentrated in the center, in the newly rebuilt areas with their beautiful brick townhouses and wide streets. Poverty was pushed to the margins, to the suburbs where cheap construction and overcrowding became the norm. This pattern of urban development, where the poor are systematically pushed to the outskirts while the wealthy occupy the desirable central locations, became a template that would be repeated in cities around the world for the next 3.5 centuries. But it gets even more interesting when you look at the economic mechanisms at play here. Before the fire, London's housing market was relatively stable because it had evolved organically over centuries. There wasn't a lot of new construction because there wasn't a lot of space, and rent was determined by fairly simple supply and demand within a constrained system. After the fire, you suddenly had this massive injection of capital into housing development. Wealthy investors saw an opportunity to make serious money by rebuilding the city. They bought up land, constructed expensive properties, and charged rents that would give them a return on their investment. This is essentially the birth of the speculative real estate market in London. Housing stopped being just about shelter and became an investment vehicle for the wealthy. Property owners weren't just charging rent to cover the cost of maintaining a building. They were charging rent to recoup construction costs plus profit and to compensate themselves for the opportunity cost of having their capital tied up in real estate rather than other investments. This fundamentally changed the relationship between landlords and tenants. It became more transactional, more purely economic, and less tied to traditional social relationships and obligations. The city authorities tried to address some of these problems, but their solutions often made things worse for the poor. They implemented regulations to try to control overcrowding in the suburbs, but these regulations just made it even harder to build affordable housing legally. So much of the cheap housing that did get built was done illegally or in legal gray areas, which meant tenants had even fewer protections. If your landlord was operating an illegal boarding house, you couldn't exactly complain to the authorities about conditions without risking being thrown out entirely. There were also attempts to provide some form of social housing, though they didn't call it that at the time. Charitable organizations and parishes set up almshouses for the elderly and destitute, but these could accommodate only a tiny fraction of those in need. The scale of the housing crisis was simply too large for charitable solutions. You needed tens of thousands of units of affordable housing, and there was no political will or financial mechanism to make that happen. What's absolutely fascinating is how contemporary this all sounds. If I just changed a few details and didn't mention the dates, you might think I was talking about modern London, or San Francisco, or New York, or any number of cities experiencing housing crises today. You've got expensive new development that meets high regulatory standards pushing up rents. You've got working class people being displaced to cheaper areas on the outskirts. You've got overcrowding in affordable neighborhoods. You've got housing being treated primarily as an investment rather than as a basic human need. You've got the geographic segregation of social classes. These patterns that emerged in London after 1666 have been repeated over and over again throughout history. The long-term consequences of this first housing disaster shaped London for centuries. Those poor suburbs like Whitechapel and Shoreditch that exploded with population in the late 1600s remained centers of poverty and overcrowding well into the 20th century. The East End of London became synonymous with working-class struggle, while the West End, which had been rebuilt with beautiful townhouses after the fire, remained wealthy and desirable. This east-west divide in London persisted for 300 years and, in many ways, still exists today, even though gentrification has complicated the picture. The Great Fire and its aftermath also established a pattern where housing crises are often triggered by disasters but perpetuated by economic and political choices. The fire itself was a natural disaster, or at least an accidental one. But the housing crisis that followed was created by human decisions about how to rebuild, what standards to enforce, who to prioritize, and how to think about housing as an economic good. The same pattern played out after the Chicago Fire of 1871, after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, and after the World Wars when European cities needed to be rebuilt. Each time, the disaster creates an opportunity for reimagining urban space, and each time, the poor tend to get squeezed out because they can't compete economically in the new order. So what's the lesson here? I think there are a few. First, housing crises aren't new, and the mechanisms that drive them are pretty consistent across time and place. When housing is treated primarily as an investment rather than as a basic need, and when regulations increase construction costs without corresponding support for affordability, working-class people get priced out. Second, geographic segregation by class isn't natural or inevitable. It's created by specific economic and political choices. Pre-fire London was certainly divided by class, but everyone lived jumbled together in the same neighborhoods. Post-fire London became spatially segregated in a way it hadn't been before. And third, how we respond to crises matters enormously. The decisions made in 1666 and 67 shaped London's development for the next 3 centuries. Today, as cities around the world grapple with housing affordability, it's worth remembering that we've been here before, we've made these mistakes before, and we've seen these consequences before. Maybe this time we can learn from history instead of repeating it. If you found this video interesting, Make sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments if you want more deep dives into historical events that shape the modern world. And seriously, hit that subscribe button because I've got so many more stories like this to share. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.